Welcome to the 52nd Prix de West Invitational Art Exhibition and Sale. Here to begin today's program is the Curator of Ethnology for the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, Dr. Eric Singleton.
Howdy. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our second day of seminars. I'd like to start by showing appreciation for our sponsors listed on the screen. The museum is able to provide quality education and experiences because of these organizations and individuals. If you see someone wearing a white sponsor ribbon, please be sure to thank them for their contributions to Prix de West. This afternoon at 1 p.m., we invite you to join artists Hui Han Liu and Daniel Keys for their live demonstrations in the boardroom and classrooms. Also, for those interested in taking home a memento from opening weekend, please visit our Persimmon Hill store located near the front entry. There you'll find a commemorative Prix de West bolos and catalogs. And while you're there, check out the trunk shows. The store will remain open until 8 o'clock this evening. We have another outstanding presentation this morning, followed by the highly anticipated Prix de West Purchase Award announcement at noon. We invite you to stay with us for the presentation of this award directly following lunch break. And now, for our morning seminar, with an extensive background in nature conservation and museum exhibitions, Walter Matia began casting bronze sculptures in 1980, initially focusing in on bird life, eventually expanding his work to sporting dogs and other mammals. Among his numerous awards are multiple Major General and Mrs. Don D. Pittman Wildlife Awards and James Earl Fraser Sculpture Awards. Last year, he was awarded the Prix de West Purchase Award for his sculpture, Molly is a Working Girl. Please welcome Prix de West artist, Walter Matia.
Oh boy. I got to do a little bookkeeping here just because everything's going to fall down. So, wow, those lights are bright. Every year you come to this show, and for me, it's generally Thursday morning at dark 30 to get your plane out here. And I generally feel pretty good about myself, or at least I think, well, I did as well as I could. And then you walk into the hall, and you see George's work, and you see Len's work, and Tucker's work, indeed Mitchell's work, and your heart starts getting a little smaller, or your ego does anyhow. But you painters actually have it pretty easy because you just got to deal with those guys. I got to deal with Steve Kestrel. And so by Sunday morning, I'm generally pretty depressed. And mostly, you get on the plane thinking, man, I really got to go back to work, which comes around to basically saying it's about the highest compliment that you can actually pay a show and pay your fellow artists. The show hangs a great show, and all of my friends do wonderful work, and it makes all of us better. I do want to thank the hall. I mean, you guys, every year, for, I guess I've been here 32 years, every year you walk in and you do the best possible to sort of see what your work actually looks like. And, you worked really hard for us, and thank you. Let's see, I'm going to get this right. Oh, so the title in your book is wrong. Susan Patterson called me a couple months ago and said, well, what's the title of your talk? And I thought about 2.5 seconds, and I said, whatever it was, 3 faces of something. And then actually last week I got around to trying to write this thing, and I really couldn't do it. So the title's different. I wanted to start by establishing my Western bona fides. This was my first horse, Tex. It was also the last horse that didn't try and bite me, kick me, throw me, run off with me, roll over on me. I have an ambivalent relationship with horses. If you're in this business long enough, you invariably get like 3 questions from people, and the first one is sort of, well, is this your hobby, or is this the answer is, well, no, my hobby is bird watching. This is my addiction. And then, it moves on to they're looking at the piece and they're looking at the price and they kind of go, well, how long did it take you to do this? And, you can see them running the mental calculations of, are you making as much money as a Wall Street Journal or a Wall Street, or, as a Walmart greeter, And then the other side of it is like, and actually, are you worth more than a Walmart greeter? But then you do eventually come to this question of, well, when did you decide you actually wanted to do this? And it's a much more interesting question because all of us, did hit a point at some point where we realized that this is pretty much what we had to do. It wasn't even what we wanted to do, it was what do we have to do? And so this morning, really what I want to do is talk to you about the people that I met along the way and some of the objects that I saw that really changed how I looked at what I do. And finally, I guess I got to talk about a dog. That's why I'm up here, I suppose. If I actually know the exact date when I no longer was going to be a doctor or a lawyer, a banker, an Indian chief, and it came on a December morning in 1968 with the discovery of 6 dead muskrats. I was a student of the Northwest School of Taxidermy, which was something that kids read Boy's Life. You could get this as a mail order deal, and I'd been just literally harassing my mother every time we'd pass a dead squirrel, I'd say, stop! And we'd get out and we'd pick the stuff up and I'd be practicing all these things. And so one December morning, I was walking around this lake that I walked around just about every morning of my life. And frozen in the ice were 6 dead muskrats, and I thought, my God, I have found the mother lode. So I chipped these things out of the ice, and I'm, walking back with 3 tails in each hand. Get to my house, go into the basement, and I am skidding these things out, all to the, following directions of the Leon J. Prix School of Taxidermy. And my mother comes downstairs, and so here's a bunch of muskrat hides, and here's a bucket of muskrat carcasses, and here's the family laundry. And mom was like, she was so smart, and she was just so rational about things. And she didn't hit the fan or anything. She just walked upstairs, and she went to the phone, and she called a man named Bill Shealy, who was the director of the Natural History Museum in Cleveland. And the conversation went something like, Bill, I'm bringing him down to the museum. He's your problem now. And I was deposited on a Saturday morning into the tutelage of these 2 wonderful people, Larry Izzard and Ellen Walters. And I spent almost 7 years, every vacation, every weekend, basically down in that basement. And I learned a little bit of taxidermy, I learned a lot about collections policy, I learned about taxonomy, I learned how to clean more glass than you can imagine. I learned to use Vicks Vapor Rub when skinning out a camel in August. I had one of the strangest dates of my life. I really wanted to ask this girl out, and I finally got around to doing it. And the day that we were supposed to go out, I got a call from the zoo, and a sea lion had died. And I wound up going to the zoo, and I spent almost 5 hours in a cooler skinning this thing out. And I got home from this, and I walked in the house, and my mother goes, "Oh my God, get you to the showers." And I went to the shower, and I turned on the water, and I'm covered with seal oil. And the water just beat it up. I mean, there was nothing that got rid of that stuff. And I wound up going on this date smelling something like a dead sardine. But man, it was great. It really was. Larry was a very fine sculptor. And I learned a great deal about early sculpting from him. He sculpted in wax. I have remained sculpting in wax. But the real thing that happened to me at the museum was I really was introduced to my first artistic animal art heroes. They had the elephant folio of the Audubon's Birds of America, which I actually got to handle. But they also had 7 or 8 sculptures by the great American animal sculptor Albert Leslie. And those two people have really remained sort of my guideposts almost 50 years later. They were absolutely fabulous. In 1975, I'd been working at the museum for full-time for about a year, and we all went to a show in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. It's called Animals in Art, and it was the first time that I had ever seen a Cunard. It was the first time I'd ever seen a number of the great European animal painters, Landseer. I saw my first Jonathan Kenworthy's. But what just sort of completely set the hook was, and it wasn't this painting, but it was a Bruno Liaforce painting of a single curlew in a big field of grass. I couldn't find a decent picture of it, but I basically left that show saying, I'm going to be an animal painter. I mean, I was sure, and I quit the museum, bundled up some sketchbooks, some watercolors, some watercolor blocks, headed off to New England, spent about 6 or 7 months basically drawing, spending a little bit too much time studying plants. But I did learn 3 things after the books and about 100 watercolors. First, painting is really, really hard. Second, I learned that I was not old enough to actually commit what you needed to do to learn this by yourself. I just didn't know how to do that. And finally, I learned that I was not going to make it through a New England winter with $150 in my pocket. So I wound up going down to Washington, D.C., looking for jobs in different conservation organizations, finally got a job working at the Nature Conservancy. I got a job working with one of the smartest and most wonderful people I've ever known, which helps when it's your first job. At the Nature Conservancy, I learned a great deal about grazing management and fire ecology. I eventually learned a lot about budgeting. I met smart people all over the country, because my job took me to every state in the Union. And I got to see this country through the eyes of really, really brilliant biologists and field ecologists. And I learned how to write a good letter, which might not sound like the Shazam moment that you might, but in fact, it was probably one of the most useful things that I did there. I didn't stop drawing. I didn't actually stop trying to do some sculptures, etc. But it was a full-time job, and you know how that goes. You know, you've got to make a lot of mistakes in this too. I did have the great good fortune over those years to come under the eyes of Lee Perkins. Lee had started basically the modern Orvis Company. His son and I had gone to college together, but he and I, for whatever reason, formed a very special bond, and he became my hunting and fishing partner for the last 50 years, or the next 50 years. Lee died last year at 93. He gave me my first fishing rod. He gave me my first shotgun. And Lee had sort of two maxims in his world. The one was, for a healthy mind and a healthy body, just spend as much time as you can walking on uneven ground. I mean, he just was like, look, get outside. And the other thing, which was sort of attached to that, was that, never let something stop you until it stops you, which he was mostly referring to weather, which resulted in so many freezing, miserable mornings in grouse woods, ducks, blinds, rivers, but he just weather never stopped him. And they're some of my most memorable and most wonderful experiences. Lee introduced me to dogs as partners. I'd had some dogs, but they were pets. Lee had them as partners, and he, over the years, I think I've had 11 or 12 dogs, and he's given me all but 2 or 3 of them. And actually, just about every one of them that he's given me is related to one of those 5 flea bags underneath the table there. Lee had a large hunting place that his family had had since the 1920s on the Georgia-Florida border. And at that place, he had a kennel of about, 35 to 45 dogs at any given time. And unlike a lot of people's kennels that had big shooting places down there, his was like completely eclectic. I mean, his kennel was made up of dogs from people's kennels who he had hunted with that he enjoyed their dogs. And so there were pointers and setters and Brittany Spaniels and German Shorthairs and Labs and Cockers and, I mean, just the whole range of things. And so over my 50 years of hunting with Lee, I got to see the hunting styles and gestures and just quirks of probably 100 different dogs. And that background has been a big part of why I do dogs and what I hope to bring to dog sculpture. If it was 1975 or 1980 and you thought you wanted to be an animal artist and you were from the East, which I was, you might be forgiven for thinking that the pinnacle of artistic accomplishment in animal art was winning the federal duck stamp. Art Deco. It was this was a time, it was the 70s, and animal painting had sort of been conflated with the conservation movement, and suddenly animal art was supposed to carry some other message beyond just, wow, these animals are incredible, and look at them in their habitat. They were supposed to also carry this, oh, and we should save them, and oh, aren't they cute, and all. And it was, you probably all remember, I mean, there was the Frame House Gallery, and Greenwich Workshop, Mill Pond Press, Wild Wings, and it was, forgive me, it was terrible stuff. But through Lee, and through his friends and through the places he took me, I was able to see a different version, an older version of animal painting, and it was sporting art. And so I got to see numerous paintings by A. Lazel Ripley and the great dog painter Percival Rousseau and Ogden Pleisner, who was sort of the East Coast go-to guy if you wanted to have a painting of you at your plantation, whacking quail. David Hagerbommer. But the man whose work just kind of rocked my socks was Frank Benson, and one of the men whose house I got to visit with had 5 or 6 really, really good Bensons. And Benson, his visual distance from his subject and his attention to the silhouette and his attention to just what could you actually see if you were a hunter, what level of detail, what level of composition could you actually understand. I really, it was what I basically chose to sort of focus on, and it's what I still focus on. There is, in fact, one person, actually 2, because you can't separate Bill and Fran Reese. Bill Reese was an artist here for many years. Bill died a few years ago, but in about 1985, or just as I was about to leave the Nature Conservancy, I was in Jackson, Wyoming, and I was in a gallery, and I was looking at these paintings, and there was one small painting of a pileated woodpecker in an apple tree, in an old winter apple tree. And I thought, God, that's a really good painting. I mean, that's a terrific woodpecker. And I turned to the gallery owner and I said, well, who is this? And they said, oh, that's Bill Reese, and he's walking up the stairs right now. And he and Fran were walking up the stairs at the old Jack Dennis Gallery in Jackson Hole. We met, we had lunch, then we had dinner, and then for the next 30 or so years, he was really the person who sort of beat me up about what to do, how to do this. Bill is the reason I'm here. He championed my nomination into the NAWA organization, and but mostly Bill forced me to actually learn more about Western art. I mean, I was sort of classically trained in European Western art, but Bill basically dragged me around to actually learn about Western art, American Impressionism. He introduced me to the great Russian painters, Rapin, Serov, Levitan, Feshin. I mean, he made sure that my yardsticks were not confined by what I thought was something worth doing. He said, look, you can't decide yet. You've got to learn it all, and then you can decide what you really want to say. Bill also got me in and out of the worst, well, as I said, my relationship with horses is ambivalent. I got a call from a director of the museum up in Saratoga Springs. I think it was the Racing Hall of Fame or something like that. And the guy goes, we have one of our donors who would like you to do her horse. And I said, I don't do horses. And he said, well, I need you to take this meeting. So Bill and I and Jim Morgan, we were all in New York visiting the Met. And I took the meeting with this client of the museums. And it was at 66th and 5th, right down from the Met. And they said, well, and the apartment's on the 4th floor. And I got there, and I go up to the 4th floor. Well, I didn't realize it wasn't the 4th floor. It was the whole 4th floor. And I met at the door at this person's personal assistant, and I walk in, and on the right, on a long hall, are 5 Munnings. Boom, boom, boom. End of the hall is a big Stubbs. To the left are 3 or 4 Herrings, a Landseer. I mean, it was just, and your heart begins to kind of like going, uh-oh. Down the middle of this room were 4 sculptures by Herbert Hasseltine of this plug called Man o' War. And it turned out that Mrs. Walter Jeffords' family's first racehorse was a Man o' War. And I was going to do her horse. So I go in and I did my mea culpas, and I said, Mrs. Jeffords, I really don't do horses. And she goes, oh, I really love your dogs. You'll do fine. And that was it. I mean, I was like, well, okay. So I left. I go across the street, and Bill's there at the Met, and I say, well, we got the job. And we went up to about 2 weeks later, we went up to where this horse was basically stabled in Pennsylvania, and the horse was out fox hunting. I mean, this horse was called Lonesome Glory. It was the money-winningest steeplechase horse in history. So theoretically, this was a pretty expensive horse. And he's out there running around in the pucker brush, and the horse comes back in, and we take all our measurements, and we do all the stuff that sculptors do. And about 2 or 3, maybe it was a month and a half, 2 months later, we built a 1/3 scale model, and I took this thing up to Saratoga Springs, and the whole family's there. And we placed it on the table, and you take off the sheet, the Shazam, and there's dead silence. And the trainer, a guy named Bruce Miller, I think his name was, kind of took me by the arm, walked me outside, walked me 150 yards down the street to the stables, goes into the stable, hooks up this flea bag, brings this horse out, and from the time Bill and I had looked at this horse to the time it was actually in racing fit, it had lost 200 pounds. And we had presented them with a Great Dane, and the horse was a whippet. So I did learn to not play in ponds that I really don't understand. Sculpture is really not like painting in one really important and complicated way. I had done my first casting in about 1980, but to get good at painting, you probably got to get 200-300 paintings under your belt, just to get the ante worked out. You're not even playing yet. But at 200 or 300 paintings, you're probably out $7,000-8,000. To figure out how to actually sculpt, you might need to do 40 or 50 sculptures. And you can be pretty quickly $250,000 out. You can't get any good at it without making mistakes, and every mistake sort of went out the door at $3,000 a piece. So in about 1983, this wonderful woman, Kiku Haynes' husband, called me up and he said, "My wife's favorite bird is the American avocet, and I'd like to get her one for her birthday, and would you do something for me?" I said, "Fine, Well, I did them, and I said, well, I don't guess it's about $1,400. I have no idea. We did them, gave the birthday present. It was great. She was thrilled. And he said, well, are you going to do any more sculptures? And I said, well, Johnny, I lost $1,000 on this project. I don't think I'm in. And he sat down and said, well, let's talk about that. And in 1984, Kiku and I, who had really bonded over fly fishing and our love of dogs, we formed a corporation called Curlew Castings of Virginia. And for about 5 years, the company lasted for 30 years, but for the first 5 years, to be blunt, they just fronted me the money for castings. I had enough money to live on. I didn't have any money to cast anything. It just allowed me to make a lot of mistakes. I couldn't have done it without them, and we had a blast. We really had fun. I also met a family, Mark and Barbara Freed. I didn't have a good picture of Mark. A number of you know Mark and Barbara. A number of you basically are in their collection. But they were builders, and every time they would build a new building or a new housing development, they'd call me up and say, we need something for the lobby, or we need something for the entrance. And they never told me what to do. They never even gave me a price point. They just said, well, we need this, we need that. And so for however long, we did pieces. And again, it gave me the ability to just do stuff. And then about 20 years ago, we decided to put together they wanted to do a sculpture garden at their place. And this was actually the model for the Houston Texans Bulls. But I got to work with a great gardener, and I got to work sculpture into the outside environment, which I really loved. It was the most fun part of it. It's where sculpture belongs. And the sculpture, the thing is we still add to it every once in a while. I guess there's about 45 or so pieces in it. Steve Kestrel's got a beautiful piece in it. This last person, basically, I could have put any number of faces in here. I could have put Susie in. I could have put any number of people in, but Bubba died this year, and he's much on my mind. He was my dealer from Dallas, Texas, and we met over a phone call where those of you who knew Bubba knew that he spoke so fast you could barely understand it. But he called, and he basically for 5 minutes told me I was an idiot for something I had actually done, which in fact he was correct. But at the end of the conversation, he goes, well, you quail hunt, right? He goes, oh, of course you quail hunt. He said, why don't you come on down here and go quail hunting? We'll straighten this all out. And so I got in the plane and I flew down there. We went quail hunting, and for 30 years, we really had a great time. And Bubba's basically deal with me is he said, look, if you'll spend about a third of your year doing things for my client base, I'll guarantee to sell them. And he did. So every year I would spend about a third of my year doing bird dogs and game birds. And then he also got me involved in some pretty fun stuff. They'd started this conservation organization down there called the Park Cities Quail. And he got me to do a medallion as a fundraising thing for all of their donors every year. And so I learned how to do medallions. And we also got to sort of mess around with sort of some pretty interesting people. That was George Strait and Boone Pickens. I will tell you, George Strait, they had an auction associated with this thing, and I watched George Strait take 4 tickets to one of his concerts. He ran it up to $140,000 by basically offering, well, you know, if you're going to come to the concert, you got to have dinner with me, and if you're going to go to the dinner, you got to go behind the stage, and oh, and by the way, here's this guitar, you ought to have this guitar, and it just was like magic. I also got to do with Bubba some really interesting wall installations. We did about a half a dozen of these at different hunting lodges. This was at Boone Pickens Mesa Ranch. That's 34 feet to that ceiling. And a number of those pieces were upwards on 150, 200 pounds, and it was the scariest day of my life, getting that stuff on the wall. So up to now, basically, it's mostly been true, and now I'm moving into sort of, well, what things really kind of moved me. And I got to start and go back to John James Audubon's pieces, because they were the first pieces of art that I was ever sort of fully engaged in thinking about. And I fell in love with the design quality, and I love the fact that his birds, unlike most bird guides of the time, had them in situ. He had them in habitat. And so I have spent a lot of my work basically thinking about how Audubon interwove his pieces with his habitat. The Audubon birds were also, Audubon's birds were not just true to the species. I mean, yeah, it looked like a grackle, it looked like a pileated woodpecker. Audubon's birds, it looked like an individual pileated woodpecker. There was an actual bird in there. And the thing I work hardest on my own work, is to make sure that what I am doing with that bird, it not only gives it sort of one of its most identifiable gestures, but I want you to honestly believe that each one of those birds, there was somebody in there. And I worked very hard at that. In 1964, our family went to the World's Fair in New York. It's the fair that gave you It's a Small World After All. And now that you have that earworm in your head, you're welcome. But we went to the Bronx Zoo, at which point I saw the Rainey Memorial Gates, which were done by Paul Manship. And I was 11 years old, so what did I know? But I knew this was seriously cool stuff. And I have gone back and looked at these gates and other gates, you know, since then. But these were the ones that really got me thinking about how you work sculpture into architecture. And over the years, I've done a number of these fire screens, it's something I've always enjoyed trying to work out. I like the problem of addressing an actual thing that had to be fitted to. I also got to do one of the most interesting projects. I did this was a solar sundial for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And I took the 12 geological periods. I had to fudge a little bit. But this was the Nomen, was a great big Cretaceous ammonite. But I took I don't know if you can see this, I took the different geological eras, I divided them so that the spaces in between the eras marked the time, and on the bas-relief plates were the major indicator fossils from each one of those eras, so that kids could go and they could look at and I tried to do as many of them as I could from the museum collection that kids could see it. And so they'd go, they'd look at the sundial, and then they'd give them a little handout sheet to say, go find this in the museum. So it worked out pretty well. I do have one more of these things that I made, and if anybody's got a good idea what to do with it, I'd appreciate it, because I don't know. So in 1999, I think, I was out at Bosque del Apache, which is the great bird refuge south of Santa Fe. And this was before digital cameras, and I basically had taken the pictures. And one of the things that's lost in the digital age is that there isn't that gap in time from when you take the picture to when you actually get back the photographs. And you're flipping through them, and I don't remember taking this picture, but I was flipping through the pictures, and I hit that, and I was like, oh my God, that's a really interesting sculptural problem. And for literally the last 20 years, I have been sculpting pieces of marsh vegetation, corn stalks, whatever, and building them into just drawings of marshes, which I add birds to for no particular reason, because I frankly like them just as drawings of marsh grass. And I've done this now, I don't know, for about 15, 20 years. And it's the only thing I do at the Foundry that's actually fun, because everything else you're just working on stuff that's already been done, and it's just drudgery. But this is, I go to the Foundry and I have half a dozen bird castings sitting on the ground and a couple hundred pieces of marsh grass in various chunks, and I just build them. I mean, I'm just drawing with metal. It's really, really fun. Where are we here? Oh, this is a piece that we did last year in Barbara Freed's garden. It was flying red-winged blackbirds, and it really worked. It was a pretty thing. Again, this was all just based on that photograph. Just how do you arrange grasses to form wonderful negative spaces? So, I do, in fact, have the dumbest supply chain in the history of the world, and it's George Carlson's fault. About, I don't know, 25 or 30 years ago, some members of the Valley Bronze Foundry were here, sniffing around for work. And I didn't have a good foundry, and this guy came up to me, and I said, well, we're Valley Bronze out in Joseph, Oregon, and we'd like to cast your work. And I just said, well, who do you cast for? He goes, well, we cast for George Carlson. And I was like, well, okay, how bad can it be? Well, it can be bad. It takes me 16 hours to get there. But the important thing about this is that I learned a lot from Albert Leslie about how to organize feathers, etc., as muscle groups, how to sort of reduce the surface noise and get it down to its sculptural, form, reduce all the noise. But it wasn't until I was actually at Valley Bronze and I saw my first original of one of George Carlson's waxes that I truly began to understand a lot about the importance of both form and edges. And you can't, I mean, if you're not a sculptor, you don't realize that you're doing your original, and there's going to be 3 generations of change from your original thought to something that's actually in metal. And learning how to adapt to those 3 generations of change is what makes your stuff either good or bad. And if you don't finally figure that out, you can't do this. And looking at George's originals, before they'd gone through the molding and wax and metal, it really changed how I sculpted. It really sort of forced me to think about edges. It forced me to really think about transitions from different masses. And so anyway, I'm sorry about the travel, George, but thanks for everything else. So I guess I'm here because of a dog. I've had 11 dogs, maybe more, I don't know. We've had some rescue dogs and whatever, I'm a bad dog trainer. Actually, that's not true. I'm a terrible dog trainer. Mostly because I really just, I don't care that much. I want to be safe, but I really just kind of like having them around. I want to see what they do as dogs. I'm not interested in them rolling over and playing dead. But I did have one star, and this was this dog, Molly. And as I said, I got Molly before I was married, and I was actually doing a lot of bird hunting. And I didn't train her at all. All I did, we just went hunting. She was great. She just figured it out, you know? I mean, she wasn't steady to shot. I mean, you'd shoot, she'd take off. She didn't actually take hand signals very well. Mostly, you know, if a duck fell a long way away, we'd just throw her in the canoe or the kayak and get her over there and said, go find it, you know. And she just did. She just naturally understood how to do this. So she was 13 years old, and I got invited to a really fancy, in fact, the oldest continuously running duck club in America, the Winus Point Club on Lake Erie. And my host, it was one of these strange places where they actually allowed the guests to bring their own dogs, which was pretty rare. And as it turned out, my host, who had terrible dogs himself, and whose guests had even worse dogs, was kind of notorious for asking people, and then the guides just had to deal with it. So I got there with Molly, and she was 13, and it's 4:30 in the morning, and we're all getting in our waders and getting ready to get in the boats to head out into this huge marsh. And the guy who was our guide said, is your dog any good? And I said, yeah, she's okay, but she's 13, and it was a really cold day, and the wind was blowing snot, and I said, so bring your dog as well, you know, let's just not be stupid about this. Well, the morning went along, and we got to the blind. Molly got out of the boat and basically went to the dog stand. We're all standing in the marsh, but you kept the dogs out of the cold on little platforms. And that impressed the guy. He was like, oh my God, this dog is actually just going to go sit there. I mean, will the wonders never cease? And so the morning goes on, and we had shot a limited ducks -1. And a pair of green-winged teal came in, and I shot, and I crippled it. And it flew about 35 or so yards out across this big open water, headed toward a huge cattail marsh. And I looked at my shooting partner, my host, and I looked at the guide, and I said, oh man, we better go. And while we're debating what to do, Molly has taken off, and she's chugging across this huge open water. And she eventually, and because she wasn't really well trained, I couldn't call her back. She disappeared into this cattail marsh. And she was gone for 3 or 4 minutes, which doesn't sound like a long time, but it was a long time. And I looked at the guide and I said, listen, let's get the boat and get over there. I'm scared. And just about this time, about 20 yards down from where she went into the marsh, she comes out of the marsh, and she's got this perfectly live teal in her mouth. And she chucked her way back, and she made it back, and she was so tired out, she couldn't even get up on the platform. I had to get down, take the duck, and haul her up. Well, anyway, we get back at the end of the day, and there's all the... We get out of our waders and we go have a drink and whatever, and I'm walking past the boathouse where all the guides are from the day, grousing about their knuckleheads that they'd guided that day. And I hear this guy go, "You're not going to believe it, but Todd's guest brought a dog, and she was actually good. She was a real working girl." And that's where the title came from, and that's why I did the sculpture, and that's my talk. And I guess we got some time for questions if anybody is foolish enough to ask. All right, that's it. Last chance. Thank you.